gentlemen, to the 4Bs. It is our opening night for, I guess, the national part of the We the People program and the national questions. And so, I forgot my new hat. I gotta wear my new hat here. Been told that we're going to become a socialist country, so I thought I'd be ready for when the socialists take over here. And so for those of you who haven't seen us before, we are the 4Bs, plus we have a guest, I guess we'll call her, but she's a special friend of ours, Liza P. From, well, she's currently residing in Washington, D.C., but she's from Massachusetts. And she's currently in Massachusetts. Anyway, that's Liza P there. So you all understand what we're doing here. We are individuals who collectively, I don't know, have 120 years, 150 years of civic education collectively. And we'd like to share that knowledge and insights for those of you who are, interested in civic education, interested in the Constitution and the American government. The players that we have here, we've kind of introduced Liza P, but we have, and I'm just going to go from my screen, we got Dr. James Michael Williams. He is a professor of political science at the University of San Diego. He is also went to law school at American University. I don't think he's a practicing lawyer, and I don't even know why he went to law school other than to, find fascinating people, predominantly women, and also to see the national monuments there. And he's got a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin there, and his focus is on comparative politics, I believe, and his specialty is South Africa. Then we have Chris Kavanaugh. Chris Kavanaugh is a nationally recognized teacher of civics, having won a national award somewhere in his deep past. He currently resides in Bismarck, North Dakota, teaches high school world studies. But for many years, he was a government civics teacher in Indianapolis, I believe South Indianapolis. And Chris has a master's from Butler. Yay, go. What are Butler people? Are they Bulldogs?
Bulldogs, baby.
Bulldogs.
Butler Bulldogs there. And I will be honest, he's probably one of the best high school teachers in the United States. Plus, he loves the weather in Bismarck, North Dakota. Then we have Professor Tim Moore. For 30 years, he was a high school teacher in and around, I guess, Milwaukee, or was it in Waukesha?
It was in Milwaukee.
Yeah, and he's got the worst broadband, system in America there. Or I don't know. Anyhow, he is currently working at the Center for the Study of the Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. Works on a lot on ratification documentation with the famous John Kaminsky, and is probably next to John Kaminsky, one of the foremost experts on ratification, and really interesting stuff that you want to share at dinner parties is probably one of his strengths. And I'm Dave Richmond. I barely graduated high school. I have no credentials whatsoever to add to this conversation. But at one time I wanted to be a radio talk show host, so I'm just living the dream right now. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the First Amendment religious clauses and education there and therein, I guess. And so I think the best way to start out is in many ways the seminal question of our time. And I think we're all aware of this concept of white nationalism, excuse me, Christian nationalism has been in the news a lot lately. And in fact, for most of my career, there's been this ongoing debate. And so I kind of want to start with Mike and Liza here. Now, Mike hates it when I call on him first. So this is kind of a test here of whether or not he's ready here. But I'm curious, Mike.
Well, the first test is looking at you with that hat on. That's the first real test.
Does the hat not work for you there, Professor Moore? It is a true Soviet symbol. This
I like the shirt. I like the shirt.
That's not working for you, I think, is the issue.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll get rid of the hat. I just, it was kind of cold today. It got down to 63 degrees here. So I was a little chilly. But Mike, I'm sure this has happened, sometime in your life, where you come across, you're having a conversation and somebody says that America is a Christian nation. And whether or not you've actually responded, I'm curious, what would your response be? That is your academic response, your understanding of the United States. How would you respond to that idea?
Yeah, I do like it when you call on me first. I would say that is the United States a Christian nation? I would say it's a bit more complicated than that in terms of those who were living in North America when the United States was founded. The Native Americans were definitely not practicing Christians, and I think those who came over from England and other places would define themselves not as, I don't think, as squarely as simply being Christian. I think it was a little more complicated than that. Now, political scientists who are much more famous than I am, such as Samuel Huntington, has made a very strong argument that we are indeed a Christian nation, and that's not something that we should run away from. That it's just something that we were Protestant Christian nation, right? If we were founded by the Spanish, Huntington argues, we'd have a much different set of political entities. So, in my opinion, I think the historical record is more complicated than Huntington and others would say. But yeah, that's where I'd start.
I just want to clarify. So you're saying, if we were founded by the Spanish, we wouldn't, or your implication is that if we're a Christian nation, we're a Protestant Christian nation. Is that what I understand? Because if we were founded by Spain,
yeah,
we'd still be Christian, but we'd be in the Catholic side of the umbrella.
I'm sharing with you what a number of political scientists, including Samuel Huntington, have argued. That, yeah, if we are a Christian nation, then we are, by our historical sort of record, a Protestant Christian nation.
So Liza, in your academic studies, and I gotta believe, because to me, this is one of the, most, oft talked about issues here. How would you respond? And again, you've been, involved in civic education for a long time. If somebody says to you, we are a Christian nation, what does that mean to you, and how would you respond to them?
Yeah, I think I'd respond much the same way that Mike did. So I'm glad he went first. Thank you for asking him to respond first. But I think I'd also say that the U.S. was founded, or at least aspires to, the idea of religious freedom. And I point to, in particular, a more modern example. I work on international development and foreign policy issues related to democratization. And one of the things that we point to quite frequently are the religious freedom reports that the State Department produces, which are required by Congress. Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which I would encourage students to read. And it requires that the State Department produce an annual report on every country on religious freedom issues. So I think, to me, that's an example of an aspirational aspect of our foreign policy that we're projecting to the world, is that the United States cares about religious freedom generally. And we care enough that there is a public report that you can go find. I would encourage students and teachers to go, read the reports on countries around the world and look at what's covered in those issues. They are required by Congress. The State Department, produces them every year. And there are certain things that are required to be in them. So I think it's an interesting example of, what we value as a country is very often reflected in the policies that we, put into place, and the requirements that we require our bureaucracy to complete and to put out for public consumption and for public use. So I think that's an interesting example of sort of putting our policy, if you will, where our, aspirational mouth is, I suppose. Butcher that expression.
So Chris, I've been waiting for this for a few hours. I'm curious about your response. Someone comes up and you're engaging in a discussion about American culture and the Constitution, and they say, well, we are a Christian nation. How do you respond to that?
I certainly would agree with both Mike and Liza, but I think my usual answer is, we are a nation founded by predominantly Christians. We are not a Christian nation. So the idea is, I think there's a difference when you start talking about nationality and you start talking about the creation of governments. Certainly colonial governments, certain colonial governments are going to have religious aspects in their founding. And if you go, early on in colonial documents, there is a religious aspect to their founding in terms of a foundational piece to their founding. But as we move forward into the founding of the United States as a nation, you will see that many of the founding fathers were men of faith, but doesn't mean that we are a Christian nation. I would like to say we're a nation founded by people who are predominantly Protestant Christian. And I don't know if that's splitting hairs, but I think that allows us the understanding when you move into documents, especially the Constitution, that there is a separation.
Well, Tim, on top of maybe your response, what's the implication? What do you think it is implied by those? And you and I both know there's a cottage industry built around this notion that America is not secular in its law or its constituting, that it is Christian. What are the implications, do you think, of people who hold that to be a self-evident truth? That there's an element of divinely inspired Protestantism within the American constitutional founding?
So I have to answer that question, right? Okay. Well, first of all, it has tremendous implications to believe that about the founding. And I've often wondered, well, actually, I used to often wondered, and I think I've concluded now that those groups that would advocate for that position, that the founding was a Christian project, I can't help but scratch my head at how modern political agenda is, I think in many of these folks' minds, their modern political agenda gets made more legitimate if you can prove that there was some sort of connection between their modern political agenda and the creation and founding of the country. And so therefore to resist their modern political agenda would be antithetical to what the framers want. I see folks who are in this camp really it's a modern desire. It's more nobilized or excuse the pun, baptized if the founding was consistent with their beliefs. So I think there's a connection between what's going on now and their belief about the past, more so than the reality of what actually happened in the past.
But isn't this something that's kind of part of our, I mean, in my general view is, and I'm kind of there with Chris, and that is, yeah, we are a Christian people, at least, in our founding, but that does not translate to a law primarily based upon Christian legalism and Christian doctrine there, and there's a fundamental gap. But hasn't this been an ongoing debate for 240 years?
No, my response would be no. I think it really kicks in the Cold War when we have to have our country divinely blessed, and we're in a war with the godless communists. And so I think we all know we started to see "In God We Trust" on all the buildings, and then I think the Board of Regents case in the early '60s, I think really ratcheted up the discussion a lot about whether we were still going to be a Christian country. I forget the name of the case, but and then I think in the '80s you started to see a lot of increased rhetoric about the Christian foundings of the country. And there's a really he sells tons and tons of books amongst evangelicals. His name is David Barton, and he's also an influential person on the Texas Board of Ed. And they've essentially been very successful at implementing some of his thoughts about the founding of America into the Texas school system, but also highly influential man in evangelical communities in the last 25 years, David Barton.
I don't know, do you guys agree with that? Because my understanding is that this has been kind of part of the national conversation for a very, I mean, even in Philadelphia, even in ratification, we see it. There's an ebb and flow to it, but we see it rise at various times. This tension between, maybe culture and the secular, elements of our Constitution. So I find that interesting that you think it's just purely a modern 1980s Cold War phenomenon.
Well, no, I'm not discounting that because in the 1800s, there's a lot of Christians that believed in what's called postmillennialism. They wanted to literally establish the kingdom of God on earth. So there was some of that notion of using religion and using their theology to achieve the heaven on earth agenda. So it was around pre-Civil War, some of the reform movements. It certainly was around with some of the Christian socialists in the late 1800s. So that millennialism has always been there, but I think and maybe it's just because I'm of a certain age that it seems to me to be really kick in heavy. But you're right. I mean, it did precede Cold War.
Well, let's get into the kind of, I guess, the framing. Let's get into the religious clauses, and before we get to ours, I'm curious, Mike and Liza. Liza, you've traveled the world, I think, much more than any of us, other than maybe Mike there. But I'm curious, Mike, about kind of a comparative view to, and especially your experiences in South Africa, to what extent does religion play a role in the constituting of modern South Africa?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. South Africa is about 85% self-defined Christian. But the South African preamble has this line in it where they say, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. And what Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, the leaders at the transition said is that while a majority of our nation may be Christians, we are not a Christian nation. And so embedded in their constitution is the same idea, the same protection of religious belief, opinion, practice. During apartheid, Christianity was used as a way to oppress Black South Africans. The Bible was read in a way to make the oppression seem like it was ordained. And so there's a real fear of maybe the role of religion in public life. Religion is very, very important to Black and white South Africans, but they would not self-define themselves as a Christian nation in a way that you kind of started off the conversation. It's much more diverse in recognizing that even though those who practice Islam or Hinduism or who practice indigenous religious practices are in the minority, perhaps, that doesn't change the fact that all religious practices are welcome as long as they don't, as long as they're balanced with protecting the human dignity of people, which is another part of the Constitution.
Liza, your experiences as far as religious tension, or I don't know if it has to be tension. I mean, we're obviously aware of global religious conflict within nation states. Obviously, China is going through this themselves. I don't know, and Mike, you'd have greater insights on Africa there, but what is your sense about the importance of religion in a nation's sense of identity and again, constituting itself, creating itself?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the context and the country that you're talking about. And I also think that really matters in terms of how a society identifies itself and identifies kind of the other in the conversation, because I think your comment about China, for example, it's very interesting to me that both the past administration and the current administration were very critical of the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, which I think both are right in their criticism. But I think it's an interesting projection of U.S. foreign policy that both the Trump administration, with some of the last statements that Secretary of State Pompeo made before he left, and then some of the incoming Biden administration statements on China have been universally supportive of the freedom of the Uyghurs to practice their religion as a minority religious and ethnic group in China. So I think the context really matters. But I think one of the biggest concerns is even countries around the world that do identify, formally as religion as a part of either their founding period, a part of how they self-identify that's intertwined with government. I think oftentimes the question then becomes their treatment of minority religious groups within the context of their society. So I think it's very context dependent. And then maybe the final thing I'd say that, I think very often it's in U.S. foreign policy, which again is where I'm coming to this conversation from. I think it's interesting when you see the statements that are made within the State Department or other bureaucracies in support of religious minorities abroad. So sometimes certain administrations will favor making statements in favor of Christian minorities abroad, and that's something we certainly saw in the Trump administration. There was, including a lot of policy support, and there was a very famous kind of controversy inside the State Department about one senior official who left her position in a very controversial way because there was a perception that she was more supportive of Muslim minorities in Christian countries than of Christian minorities in predominantly Muslim countries. So it definitely creeps into foreign policy, of course. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there.
So Tim and Chris, if you could take, what, in your opinion, what was the intent of the religious clauses? And again, we not only have the religious clauses, that is, what's the experience, what are the historical and experiential factors that lead them to one, insert in Article 6, the no religious test, and then the creation of the First Amendment? And does it all is it all part of this journey of disestablishment that seems to me starts with John Locke back in the 17th century? So I know that's a kind of a big thing, but if you guys can kind of deal with the intent here, what were the framers hoping to accomplish?
Well, I'm going to go first. That way Tim can go after me and clean up everything that I say. But I think of listening to Liza, what she just said, made me think of you start to see, especially maybe with a Jefferson or a Madison, coming to support religious minorities in this country early on. And those, of course, would be the Baptists. And you guys know, I've talked about this before. And if you look at Madison's memorial and remonstrance, and for students that are watching this, and you guys that are going to be preparing for this question, Madison's memorial and remonstrance is a document that you've got to go to. But you see that these guys, or Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, but the idea that these religious minorities are the ones that maybe some people are actually trying to protect by this. And we had a discussion earlier in one of our videos about conscience, right? The idea of liberty of conscience and what that means. And I think that there's somewhere at the heart of that, when these guys are children of the Enlightenment that are starting to write documents, I think that comes into play there. So back to the original question, you start to see this I think the simple, easy answer is they saw religion corrupting government and government corrupting religion. They had a blueprint in England, and so they probably wanted to avoid some of that. Can I flash a book now? Is this the right time to flash a book?
At any time.
Okay, so this is what I was digging around for. So I would recommend this too. I'll hold this up close.
All right.
I don't get any kickbacks. So really good book by Matt Stewart about nature's God, the heretical origins of the American Republic. So different viewpoint for sure.
Professor Moore?
Well, I think I read the religion clauses in the First Amendment, I think the official political science way to describe it would be, I have a federal reading of the religion clauses, meaning that those two clauses primarily had everything to do with religious issues at the national level, and therefore was pretty much, the states were left alone to do whatever they were doing. And there were, almost every state had religious test clauses for holding office. I think Rhode Island may have been the only one. Many of those religious test clauses were Christian. In other words, you had to believe in the Old and New Testament. They were Trinitarian too. So many of those. So states had established religions. They were, now the weird thing is that many of the states banned clergy from holding office. So when I look at the First Amendment's clauses, now this is all pre-14th Amendment incorporation. That changes everything. But before, I would say the First Amendment is only a statement about the national government, and states could do whatever they wanted. And they were pretty, there were established churches. I mean, Chris is right. I mean, Madison and Jefferson are way out there on the, way out there. They are not in lockstep with most Americans. When they want, I mean, they would be considered the crazy liberals. They do not represent most founders in a total disestablishment framework, because many of the states, like I said, had an entrenched requirement for offices, holding office in tax-supported institutions.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I want to just jump back though. I think Tim's comment goes back to, the first question, the idea that people want to hold on to this notion that we're a Christian nation, and pre-Constitution, everything is really happening at the state level. Even post-Constitution, as Tim pointed out, everything really is still happening at the state level. So when you have these states with established religions, official state-sponsored religions, I think therein lies a better argument for the idea of a Christian nation.
Yeah.
So I think there's an argument to be, if you want to make that argument, there's where you hang your hat, so to speak, on those state constitutions.
But this comes back to Chris's point. Chris had made a fantastic point. There's a difference between being a nation that has a lot of Christians in it versus a nation that creates a Christian nation. I mean, honestly, I think if a little mind game, if Catholics would have created America, I think we probably would have a state religion, because we look at what the Catholic Church's relationship to government in the New World, they were clearly theocratic. Can't play in the sandbox. Protestants that are coming over are they don't like each other, and there's a lot of different flavors. But Chris's point's very valid. There's a difference between a nation that has a lot of Christians versus a Christian nation.
Mike.
Yeah, I want to jump on your comment and then Chris's comment. I mean, I think that evidence that at the founding there were states that had religious tests and had established religion, I think it cuts against the argument you just made, Tim. I think that there maybe were a lot of Americans who thought that maybe their own faction in their own state wanted to have us live by certain Christian rules, right? And I would disagree. You said earlier that the 14th Amendment changes everything. It changes everything legally, but just like the 14th Amendment didn't change everything in terms of attitudes about race. I think there's a lot of historical tools, evidence that people can make a comment like the one Dave started off with. So I think I'm kind of contradicting my very first point, which is great. It only came 30 minutes into it, so I'm on a roll. But yeah.
Well, so here's my thing. I mean, if you say Jefferson and Madison are way out there, but Jefferson's not at the convention. there. Jefferson's not part of writing the Bill of Rights. You know, if there's any legitimacy whatsoever to this illegal, you know, Christianity or legal Christian law, wouldn't they have written it down? It just seems so clear to me that if you just look at the text, they wanted to stay as far away from you know, church and state as they could. And Article 6 makes it clear. I guess where the ambiguity is, and I'm curious how you all understand the Establishment Clause to the First Amendment, because the Free Exercise Clause is a little simpler to understand. Congress shall make no law, and then the states shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. But the Establishment Clause, I'm curious about your reading of that, and because that seems to muck up, or that seems to complicate things. And those who advocate Christian nationhood, they focus absolutely 100% on the Free Exercise Clause. And they try to stay away from the Establishment Clause, or in my view, they've, you know, tried to manipulate that in many ways. So I'm curious about everybody's take on what does that clause mean to you?
Well, I just have to, I flash back. I can't help but think of the late, great Kermit Hall, who I think we've all had a chance to study at the feet of or be grilled by one or the other. And for the students watching this, Kermit passed away several years ago, but he was a scholar in the network, law professor, president of the university when he passed. But I remember at a lecture one time, he was talking about the Establishment Clause. He goes, nobody really knows what that means. It's like, okay, good. I'm off the hook. Yeah, check. I think, you know, what I see it as, and what did Madison mean and the Congress mean when they, you know, drafted Madison's proposals, or they edited Madison's proposals for the Bill of Rights. You know, I think that I see those as two different things. I think the easy answer is that government's not going to favor one religion over another.
At the national level.
Yeah, at the national level. Yeah, you go back to Tim's point. Very, very good, Mike. Yeah, so that's, but I can't help but think of Kermit saying, no one really knows what that meant. So I'll defer. That's my answer.
I've got to ask, Chris. I mean, you say shall not. How about it shall not establish a church?
Well, I think the idea is to establish, religion. I think, the idea that, you know, I see that now, though. My perspective is right now, and based upon what I've read and studied, is just and what the court has said through the years.
This is where I think Madison and Jefferson are way out there, because they would have said conscience, not religion, which it would have made it even more broadly. But I mean, the phrasing in the First Amendment dials that back, because you know, I think it's New York and Rhode Island had freedom of conscience in their statements about religious liberty. Everybody else framed it within established or within religions and denominations. But I think, you know, your reference to memorial remonstrance is great, because Madison's argument is conscience further than religion.
Can I ask a question, Dave, of all of you? So I'm curious, is federalism just such a strong necessity at the founding that that's the leading principle, that everything else that flows from that, they're just thinking we have to let it go because we need strong federalism? Because the more I'm listening, the more I'm thinking, so a lot of the founders at the state level weren't really afraid about the establishment of religion because they're doing it in their states. But is that a result of federalism, or is it because if Madison and others wanted to tell states you can't establish a religion, were those forces so strong at the local level that they just couldn't have, I don't know, enforced that kind of desire anyway? So how much of this is about federalism? How much of it is about not caring, and how much of it is just about not having the enforcement?
If I understand Akil Amar, his whole argument is it's all about federalism. Is that you know, you're absolutely right. the state governments, are clearly are not shy about promoting religion in one way, shape, or form. So this was a way to keep the national government out of the state business, and that the national government shall not favor one, because we understand that we are a diverse country religiously relative to most other countries at the time. You go from the Church of England, you've got Presbyterians, you've got Lutherans, you got the whole gambit there of traditional Christianity, and then you've got a small contingency of Judaism and things like that. So Mike, it's all about federalism, and maybe it's, we have to talk about the framing of these, but it really doesn't blossom until the 20th century and post 14th century, or 14th Amendment, 20th century post 14th Amendment, when this really blows up into one of the most adjudicated and contentious issues of our society and culture. So I wonder, does it really matter what their intent was back in 1790, 91, or 1787, 88? Does that really matter? Given, the changes that have gone on and given our society in the 20th century. Do we need to reference what their intent is back then when American society has changed so much? Thoughts?
Well, I would, one thing, I've got two things here, sorry. One, you guys have heard me say this before, and for the students who are hearing this for the first time, go to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. As free and independent states, we have the ability to do these things, right? Levy war, conclude peace, negotiate treaties, all these things. And so, as states are their own entity. So of course, if states feel like they want to make the Anglican Church their official church of the state, they're going to do that. And then you have the debates at the convention, and then certainly that federalism issue takes over. And we know that, and students probably know by this time that the Federalist Papers are trying to assuage those fears that states are still going to be able to maintain certain autonomy. Fast forwarding to, does it matter now, David? Yeah, I think it does. And all you have to do is look at the case that the court ruled on late into the night just a couple days ago, out of California, out of your guys' state, right? And that was a huge issue, and especially the way some of that was handed down. And so when you look at the makeup of the court today of people that consider themselves textualists or originalists, and you look at the deference these textualists or originalists are granting towards religious institutions today, I think it's, if we want to be, if we or they want to be consistent, we have to look at 1787, 1788, 1791. I think it's imperative.
So I'm curious, the four of us have been students, teachers, we've had children go through the system. Liza, you went through the system. Why do you think this is one of the most contentious issues as far as when it comes to law and adjudication? That is, why do we argue about it so much as a culture? I mean, I just say, I looked at it, we have, in many ways, I think religion ranks second as far as the number of adjudicated cases since World War II, next to federalism. All right, so it pretty much tells us that it's ranked highly as far as American conflict. Why do you think that is, Liza, from your own experiences? Now, again, you're from, I don't know, do they call it Eastern Massachusetts, where you're from?
I don't.
I was trying to visualize the map there, because I know we talk about Western Massachusetts a lot, and it being much more conservative in many ways than the rest. So I'm just curious about your experiences and why you think that this is such a contentious issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. Where I work at Democracy International, we just finished a study that was looking at international development assistance in countries that have conflicts that are predominantly, that have religion as a core aspect of the conflict. And we did research in 2 countries in particular and looked at the intersection of if development assistance can support, changing any aspects of that. And I think one of the interesting things, the findings are, I mean, if you want to research the findings, they're interesting in themselves. But I think one of the implications is there is a sense in, assistance that the U.S. provides formally to other countries that that societies have conflict based on religion that turns violent. And I think one of the biggest concerns and one of the reasons it is such a, an important topic to debate in the public sphere is so that doesn't happen, so that we are able to have, civil discussions and debates about the role of religion in politics, so that it doesn't, as it does in many places, result in conflict based on religious differences. And I think a related point I'd make, I mentioned earlier the Office of Religious Freedom that produces the religious freedom reports from the State Department. And I think it's interesting to look at the measures that they look at in international religious freedom. How does the United States in its formal foreign policy examine international religious freedom in every country in the world? And 2, I'll raise 2 of the, I think there are 5 categories, but one of them is the status of government respect for religion. And the second is status of societal respect for religion. And I think it's interesting, David, because you keep talking about culture. And I think it's really interesting in that is one of the ways, sort of looking at this is how a society treats religion is given equal weight in how the United States, as part of its foreign policy, looks at if, a country has, the ability for people to practice religion freely. So I didn't exactly answer your question directly, but I think that would be my response to it. And I would encourage students to look at the Office of Religious Freedom, again, not just the actual reports and what they're saying about each country, but how they measure whether a country has freedom of religion versus not.
Other thoughts as parents, students yourselves and I'm just curious if any of you have ever had, conflict over religion in your life experiences. Tim's smiling because Tim has a unique experience of teaching at a private Christian school there. And I have no idea if your kids always went to a private Christian school. But I'm just curious there. Kind of.
Well, I think to your first question, David, why we argue about this, I think it's a matter of identity for religious people, whatever the religions, whatever that faith is. It's not just it's part and parcel to identity. And so whenever these issues come up, we get heated because we configure who we are metaphysically. It's just not a system of belief. It's a core part of being. And so I think, and frankly, we have religious roots in this country.
Chris, any personal experiences?
Yeah, well, first I want to dovetail with what Tim had just said about it being so personal. This is incredibly personal for people. And I think it's also, and I don't know, maybe this is just maybe me reading into it, but there is a rightness or wrongness that goes with that. Because when people wrap up their identity, people of faith, and I'm not poo-pooing that. I think it's very, very important to so many people to have that faith. But when they wrap up their identity in that faith, and then sometimes a ruling may come down, or a law may come down, or something will come to challenge that, right? And so there's a feeling that, am I wrong in believing this? Is my faith not as good as I thought it was? There's a value judgment being placed on me as a person because the government may be taking some type of stance that may be contrary to my faith, because my identity, and Tim, I'm agreeing with you in terms of identity, but trying to take it a little bit further in that perhaps there's a value judgment being placed upon that, and then people get so defensive in that for when their faith is questioned, because when their faith is questioned, then their identity is questioned, and it just becomes so personal for people. I think it's a really tough thing. And for me personally, I can think when my son was in elementary school in the town where I used to teach, we used to have release time for religious education in the middle of the week. And I know the courts have ruled on this, and but the way we were doing it, I don't think it was actually constitutional. It certainly wasn't what what we wanted for our son at the time. And his education stopped. Really, his education stopped for a period of time every week while kids got on buses and went to predominantly Christian churches to, get religious education. And my feeling is, well, that's kind of frustrating because this is the school day, not Sunday school. So I don't know. And I struggle with that. But again, being an employee in the corporation, the last thing you want to do is raise legal objections to the policies that they have there. If I was a parent not employed by the school corporation, I would have probably called an attorney. I just struggle with it.
Well, the kind of the seminal case in this, and this is the case that the students are asked to kind of focus on, is Wisconsin versus Yoder, a early 1970s case. I think it involves both clauses of the First Amendment, religious clauses, but anyhow. But I'm curious, to what degree did Yoder kind of open the floodgates to all the contentiousness and adjudication of religion in the public square vis-a-vis the schools there? So I want you to think about that. But before I get to that, Mike, I'm just curious, at the university level, and you teach it again at a private university, it does have a religious affiliation there. How does the university balance the fact that they want to recruit, it seems to me, a diversity of students, yet they are a religious institution? Is there any struggle that you sense on your campus? Is there any problem on your campus with religious liberty and the mission of the school, which has to have a religious element to it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a struggle. I would say that a lot of private Catholic schools, which USD is, if they're linked to an order, then they can lean into, like, we're Jesuits, so we practice our religion this way. USD does not have an order, so we tend to fall back on Catholic social teaching principles. So that leaves a lot of space for students to explore what that may mean to them, whether they're Catholics or not. And for those of us faculty, we talk about this, and we like the idea, like, if we were teaching at a public school, the kinds of questions and the kinds of maybe debates we'd have in class, we might have to be a little more careful than we're having at a place like USD, where, religion, it can be on the table in all different sorts of ways that might be a little more constraining if we were at San Diego State.
Do you understand what I mean about Wisconsin versus Yoder opening the floodgates?
Yeah, and I think it's a valid point. The homeschoolers, I think, make a similar argument that the Amish did.
Yeah.
So I do see a connection between the Yoder case and now.
And so I'm curious, Tim, what you feel about Yoder, because I'm a critic of the Yoder decision, partly because of the floodgates that it opened. But also I think that, there's a free exercise element to it by making the decision, at least initially, there's also an establishment problem here, is they gave the Amish an exemption, all right, that didn't apply across the board, at least at the time. And then
right.
Again, it didn't open the floodgates for all these other groups to get an exemption. And in many ways has been one of the primary sources of undermining the mission of public schools in this country. Call me wacky, call me dangerous, but anybody other thoughts about Wisconsin versus Yoder?
Well,
at the state level, there was an arrogance in the Wisconsin Supreme Court in assuming that these poor Amish children would never stand a chance in the modern world if they didn't go to Wisconsin public schools. And so therefore, we have every right to make you go to public schools, because it was a very paternalistic decision. Without public schools, you're screwed, Amish people. You're going to wind up wards of the state. I mean, they made some of the most ridiculous arguments in support. Now, the Amish looked at that and said, "You just don't understand who we are. That we don't have poverty rates. Our kids know how to add 1, 2, and 3. Some of your public school students can't." So the Amish looked at the decision as a really heavy-handed, arrogant decision, and obviously cheered the U.S. Supreme because it created a space for them to exist by themselves. But I think the Amish case really does reveal an identity issue. The Wisconsin Supreme was attacking their identity, and it was a more deeply textured set of issues than just education. It was identity.
Chris?
Well, I think that, I think when you talk about Yoder, and I think you have to throw in Engle v. Vitale, I think is a case
Yes.
where I'm sure the students will be looking at is essential when you start talking about separation of church and state in terms of what happens in public education. I think it's important to note too that, I worry about that slippery slope kind of thing, right? When you start to say, well, my free exercise of religion tells me that I can chastise you for your sexual orientation. My freedom of religion can chastise you for the fact that you are a different faith than me, and I believe that you're going to go to hell. And I've had to referee a couple of discussions in class years ago between that. But of course, the idea of learning how to get kids to craft arguments, but I think that creates that slippery slope. And I keep thinking of Masterpiece Cake Shop. The other cases in the public square, but you have to understand now we're dealing with minors and the whole in loco parentis issue, of kids being young and when the state can step in and when the state cannot step in. And I think, and I don't know, I think obviously there's a line there in terms of ages of people involved in these cases. So I think that it's something for the students to pay attention to. But when you have the courts coming in Yoder or in Engle v. Vitale or several other key cases, how does that affect things going forward? And where are we now?
Yeah.
Where are we now in terms of what this allows kids to do if they choose to stay in the public schools?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I don't want to lose the history we were just talking about. I mean, for most of our history, religion has been able to operate a lot in our public institutions. And despite the passage of the 14th Amendment and despite incorporation, to me, Engle is the key. I mean, if your identity is really infused with your religious beliefs, and you have had a history of going to a public school and praying, and then here comes the state telling you can't do that, talking about fancy-wancy incorporation doctrine, right? That to me, it sets up a fundamental sort of struggle between different social forces, right? And what's ironic is the United States, compared to other advanced democracies, is pretty secular. And we're becoming more and more secular. To some extent, you could see this as maybe a minority, but people who see their way of life changing and they're drastically trying to hang on to it. And you see that in what you called the arguments, you see that in the litigation, you see it in trying to, with Yoder, it's just, I want to opt out. If you're not going to let me practice what my community wants to practice, then I will opt out. And I think those of us thinking about the role of public education in terms of democratic citizenship. Now, I know that the court in Yoder said there was plenty of evidence that the kids were still going to get that, and I don't want to be paternalistic, but I think that's a real concern as we move forward and see more and more communities start to opt out of public education. Maybe that empirical sort of determination the court made maybe should be revisited. I mean,
Yeah.
in fact, do families that homeschool, are those children getting that sort of democratic citizenship education that we think is necessary? I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just, and if there's data out there that I don't know about, then we should look at it. But
Well,
yeah.
I'm shaking my head no, because I think you all know that I have a sister who, for religious purposes, homeschooled all three of her children. And I can tell you that their understanding of their civic responsibility and actually their entire academic life was greatly diminished. And that's not passing judgment on all homeschool, because there are outstanding, expressions of, young people who come out of homeschool situations ready. But I think across the board, and this is my problem with Yoder, is it undermines the civic mission of schools. If you're going to exempt, such a percentage of people from that, it weakens our national connectivity to each other. And in that balance that we talk about in Unit 1 of individual liberty and the common good, it very much weakens the common good there. And again, and it goes far beyond just the exemption. Now we're talking about, according to the First Amendment, religious interpretation, exempting kids from curriculum, exempting kids from events, to where it's very difficult in the public school environment to kind of, to do much of anything without alienating, a group or faction of people within the system. I see that as a byproduct of Yoder, as it's played out. Now, maybe that's an extreme view, but excuse me.
No,
Tim,
I think there's something to that, David, and I actually would agree with it. But I would add one other step in terms of opt out. I think in many ways this educational trend is actually very American in a market sense. I see the growth of private schools. I see the homeschoolers. I see all of that as education equals marketplace. I mean, if I can go to the store and there's 18 different kinds of, a cream of mushroom. I mean, Americans love choices at the grocery store and whatever, and shoes. And I mean, for heaven's sakes. So in a way, I think it's kind of inevitable. Education is going to become a commodity, and the opting out of this monolithic, one size fits all public school system, I think it was inevitable. I mean, Diana Hess really is, I was in a conversation with her. She's a prophet in Madison. She used this free market laissez-faire argument in her assessment of the growth of private and non-public education.
well, let's switch gears for a minute. I'm just curious, because one of the things that students are asked, to the right to education, and why, again, does such a right exist? I hear it all the time. If such a right exists, does it exist outside the bounds of state governments? And and should we and could we establish a right to education nationally?
The case law on this is overwhelming in so many different areas. You have a lot of case law out of California in terms of equity in education, right? Money being spent. So there's a I don't know if this is a technical term, but a crap ton of litigation in terms of just where the money is spent, right? You go back, and I would encourage the students to look at a case, if they've not, is Plyler v. Doe, where you get some language in this case that will talk about the right to an education. And that's coming down from the Supreme Court, and that's dealing with educating children of undocumented people. And whether that is, and I think honestly, David, I would be happy to not only incorporate a positive right to vote in the Constitution, I would be more than thrilled to incorporate a positive right to an education. Now, then therein lies the problem. like you have the right to an attorney, it doesn't mean you have the right to a good attorney. Just like you have the right to an education, where's the bar set for that?
Right.
I do think there's enough case law out there now to say that I think the courts would recognize the fact that you have the right to a public education.
Well, does anybody disagree with Chris on that? Or are all of you on the same page of that in an ideal world, a positive right to education would be a good thing?
Chris,
I don't know.
Well,
Go
let's
ahead,
go with Liza. Let's go with Liza.
No, I'm with Chris. In part, from the international perspective, I think obviously the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not enforceable in the United States, but it is an aspirational document, and an aspirational document that United States was instrumental in creating and, supporting other countries to ratify. So I think it's, if you look at the Article 26 of the UDHR, it does talk about the right to education. And I think as the United States, we should aspire to live up to the fundamental human rights that Eleanor Roosevelt and other, great Americans were sort of key to, putting forward to the world, that this is what the United States represents, in our foreign policy, how we see, where do human rights begin in the small spaces close to home, and I think that's true in education also. So I agree with Chris.
Well, let me jump back too, and I'm sorry to I don't mean to dominate here, but if you guys are talking about making this, you're making this argument that if we allow people of faith to pick and choose in cafeteria style because it's going to upset the civic mission of schools, if you believe that there's a civic mission of schools, by God, there should be a right to attain that. So,
by God.
We're all here. I was trying to figure out.
Well played, Liza.
I was trying to read faces because Mike and Tim both looked like they wanted to say something, but we're holding back. Mike,
I'll just be a curmudgeon to say I don't think we need an affirmative right, because as I understand, I could be wrong on this, but I think every state's constitution does guarantee that. Now, as Chris did say, the devil's in the details as to what that education is going to consist of and who's the delivery system. And so just as a floor, I think most states, if not all states, have that positive right already there. Now, then a whole new set of floors and ceilings are going to come into the legal system. So, I mean, I don't know whether all states do, but I suspect all states do have that statement already in their systems.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this litigation, but I did hear something today that maybe some of you already know about, and we could put this in the show notes. It was on NPR today. In 2016, 7 families sued Michigan under the 14th Amendment, arguing that the state failed to provide their children with the ability to read. And just recently in 2020, the Federal Appeals Court for the first time upheld that. Now, I don't know anything more about the decision. I can share a link to the podcast as an op-ed by one of the mothers, but I think this kind of aligns with what we're talking about here. There's ways to maybe utilize the 14th Amendment and to maybe not a right to education, but I'm teaching a comparative politics class right now, and the authors of the textbook argues using this idea of the capabilities of the state and a good life, and that literacy should be one of the fundamental metrics by which we decide whether we live in a good society or not, right? And I was having my students think about just not literacy in the United States in general, but let's look at literacy rates among different populations within the United States and compare those to other countries. So I don't know, this struck me by hearing today this idea of children leaving school and not being able to read. Maybe that's the way we can go about thinking of right to education a little more narrowly.
And here's my story, because I being in the state that I live in, again, education is one of the most adjudicated issues here in the state of California. Also, the education code is probably as complex as the federal tax code here, and the burdens put on schools and teachers are overwhelmingly, and again, not to diminish the fact that there are children who who go through the system, and they're not prepared in many ways. I understand that. I think it's a deeper question of why that is, and my problem is, there used to be a sense of right and responsibilities went hand in hand. Now the modern day construct of rights, and mentioning Kermit Hall taught me this about the rights revolution, and the rights revolution had a diminishing marginal effect on the other side, and that was responsibility. And so now our society all talks about rights, rights, rights. And again, for those of us who are in public schools, we're well aware of that. The ability of schools to control their own environment, all right, and to establish regulations, rules, and things like that have diminished greatly because of California's excessive reading of the right to education there. And so I would have a problem, Chris, establishing a national right unless we define that in such a way, with some strict parameters of what that means. Because I'm generally more of an equality of opportunity. The right to education means that everybody should have access. And I do firmly believe that the right of education means that we should spend the same amount of money on every kid in America. That may have to be adjusted for geographic cost of living factors, but we should, because I know in the state of California, even though we've done better than most states, the disparity between schools is still significant. Nationally, it's atrocious. We're up to like $25,000 per student some places spend, and we're still down around $6,000 per student where places spend.
So David, hold on a second though, but think about what you're saying here. You don't want this national coming in because you think it's already being handled at the state level. Is that what I'm hearing? Right? Yeah. As back to Tim's point, and herein lies the federalism issue, right? Because, don't tell us how to educate our kids in North Dakota. But now you're talking about the government coming in and making sure that equal money is spent. So we don't want to level the floor here in terms of what an education means, but we do want to level the floor in terms of money spent. So that seems like it's kind of
no. I'm just asserting Plyler versus Doe. Plyler versus Doe said there is, they made it clear there's no right to an education in the national constitution, but right. They said if a state is going to provide public education, right, then they must provide it to all people.
Right.
And I'm sorry, I should have wrote down it's San Antonio case. The court punted on funding.
Yeah.
They were given an opportunity under the 14th Amendment, all right, to require states to equalize funding, and they punted on that in many ways, and it depends on how you read it there. So I'm all in favor of the federal government establishing, an equal protection to education through funding. What I'm not in favor of, and Chris, it gets to the First Amendment, is establishing the right to an education that extends to like the First Amendment. And here's what's happening. And I can't talk for Indianapolis or North Dakota, but in California, we're getting to the point that, remember what public education is. It's communitarian. All right. It's mass education. It's part of the 19th century movement of mass movements. And I'm talking about cultural movements like mass leisure and mass entertainment, mass education. Publics there are to educate the masses in the civic mission of schools. That was the primary purpose in the 19th century. What has happened since? All right, we've gotten it to the point where now it's independent study. It's independent study in a lot of classrooms. Well, I've got to, under federal mandate and state mandates, this kid has a certain special ed designation or whatever, and we've got to accommodate that stuff. Right. To the point that we've lost a sense of mass education, and now they want public schools to do individualized, And I hear from parents, what are you doing for I want my kid. Well, I'm fine with that if the state wants to fund it to where I only have 15 kids in a class. But my last year, I had 2 classes over 40. How am I supposed to do individualized education when my average class size was 38 and 5 classes?
I understand that. Believe me, I've had large class sizes as well. And I don't disagree with that, David. I think that becomes an issue. And I agree that, I mean, I always have called public schools a great democratizing agent in our country. If you think about it, what other thing do we have that really hopefully levels the playing field for people and to create and engage in enlightened citizenry to a degree, right? But I would argue that schools today are merely a reflection of the societies in which they exist. And 3 of us are longtime public educators. We know that in our careers that we've seen schools take on larger and larger and larger roles in society because the places that used to fulfill these roles have diminished their role. So when the stakeholders in the community say this is what we want our public schools to do, schools merely reflect that. And rightly or wrongly, and I would agree with you on some of that, David, that it's been very difficult. I mean, I can just think of, honestly, I don't have to think very hard because the last period of my day is spent with a freshman class, and I have a lot of kids in there that need a lot of extra help. I have an aide for 4 students, but I also have some of the really bright kids. And so I have this split of kids, and you don't want, kids to be left behind. And so you want to try and accommodate them, but you also have some kids that need to be pushed. And how do you push these kids in the same class while accommodating kids that need a lot of help? I would just argue that these schools are just merely a reflection of what the stakeholders want. And they're wanting more and more out of schools, in feeding kids and finding safe places for kids. All kinds of things that we didn't used to have to do 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, which gets us, that's taking us a little further away from, I think, our discussion. And I don't want to do that.
Mike, you're leaning in. I don't know if you're thinking about something or no?
No, not on this, no.
So
I would recommend a case for students to think about in conjunction with Yoder. Did I glitch out
yeah.
there?
Yeah. Well, let's finish with a brief thing on it, kind of a case study. And I think that's.
Am I back?
Sort of.
Sort of.
Myers. There was an interesting one of these cultural and religion and, well, more cultural and education cases in the 1920s called Myers versus Nebraska, where I think this issue of language shows up in the school system. And yes, it was an education case, but I also think it's a kind of a case study in local culture. To your point, David, a communitarian impulse with local education. There was a tremendous resistance to the teaching of German. So some of these early cases in the early 20th century reveal some of these early fights about education, identity, and the threats to how we configure ourselves at a local level. So I would suggest students maybe think about Myers versus Nebraska a little bit.
I do have one more thing to add. It's a comparative perspective I wanted to share with the students. South Africa, in its constitution, has a protection of religious, like I said, practices. And specifically, they say in public schools that religious observations are allowed. And that includes prayer, it includes dress, it includes hairstyle. And they don't direct exactly what schools need to do, but they say you need to be equitable and you need to provide the space for students to do this. And it makes me reflect on how much of our current debate is often because we're coming from a place of trying to debate a document that was written so many centuries ago that if we were to rethink it today, would we be okay with having prayer in schools if we could guarantee that that was going to be equitable, that the Muslim students were going to have the ability to pray just as well as the Christian students and the Hindu students. But we're coming from this Enlightenment period where these lines were drawn, I don't know, much starker than the realities of their societies. Whereas I see South Africa's constitution, as muddled as it is and as wordy as it is, really trying to make space for these different kinds of cultures to really kind of live side by side in a way that seems much more realistic than the way we're trying to do it by simply telling folks, you can't do this and you can't do this and you can opt out for this. I think it goes against the common good, David, as you were talking about before. And I think there's other models that I'm sure Liza knows about from other countries as well that are trying to do this in a way that maybe is a little more effective than the ways that we're trying to do it through litigation and otherwise.
Well, see, I'm going to disagree with that, Mike. I mean, I'm thinking of that old Snickers commercial where they used to say not going anywhere for a while, where there's some professional football team and they're bringing in a priest, a rabbi, a shaman, and everybody's going to come in and do their thing, right? And I think that's all well and good, but we're talking about within a school, within a mandated, right, a mandated required public sphere. So, Engle didn't take prayer out of school. Engle just took out teacher-led prayer at school. And, as long as are geometry tests in school, there will be prayer. It just may not be a teacher-led prayer. And in my old school, we had a really high degree, we had a lot of Islamic students, and we provided space for them to pray during the course of the day. So that is available. Of course, we also had a very active FCA. So, I mean, there are ways for people to carry out their religious faith within that public sphere, as long as it's not, it's not me leading it. But on a more current note, in the North Dakota State Legislature, there's a bill proposed now that would allow schools to post the 10 Commandments. And they're trying to also grant immunity to schools that decide to do that, so that we would not be held liable for posting those 10 Commandments. And there are some other people that are saying, you probably don't want to go down that road because that's been adjudicated and you probably don't want to do that. But that's a piece of legislation in the North Dakota State Legislature right now.
We're going to let Liza close us out tonight. Liza,
well, I just wanted to make a recommendation on a similar point that Mike made and recommend to students that if you're interested in looking at a comparative perspective, there's a lot of interesting research related to the role of religion and education coming out of Ireland that, over the last 30 years related to, the peace accords, and particularly recommend some research done by Dr. Keith Barton, who some of you may know, who writes a lot about he's a social studies methods professor out of Indiana University, but looking at the intersection of education, religion, and peace building, because a lot of the research looking at specifically the conflict in Northern Ireland looks at the intersection of, where critically public education has played a role in trying to build bridges between communities of faith that differ on fundamental issues that have led to violence. So I would highly encourage reading some of the even more recent studies that have come out about the intersection of education and peace building and conflict related to religion specifically.
Well, I am, hopefully in the future we can have a conversation about treaties and why America is involved in these treaties that we never have to follow. I mean, like the Treaty of Versailles and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I find that fascinating there. So, I didn't open with this, but good conversation given that, and I'm going to break out into song here, but we have one evangelical, two fallen Catholics, and a fat man in a deist tree. So that is our group. We'll see you next time. We'll let you know the topic as soon as we, open up there. So thank you. Bye, bonds. Peace, love, yogurt tacos.